That's a very interesting one. A knight, a medieval knight, against a Roman legionary. In a duel, who would win? First things first. What kind of medieval knight are we talking about? What kind of legionary are we talking about? Why is this a very important thing to decide? Because first off, no matter what kind of legionary we're talking about, if by knight we mean a late medieval knight in full plate armor, that's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. The Roman legionary has no chance. The technological gap between a 16th century full sort of medium carbon steel armor is too much against any legionary, to be honest. But unless you're talking about a complete idiot of a knight against an incredibly experienced legionary, then I would say no chance. The legionary will be at such a disadvantage against a full plate armored knight, regardless of mount, not even considering the mount, just foot combat, we would have such a disadvantage because the legionary would have to find a way to basically put him on the ground and subdue him, possibly opening the helmet, if the helmet wasn't, closed firmly, because as we know after the Battle of Agincourt, quite a few knights actually started asking their armorers to find new ways to make sure it wasn't so easy to open up the visor, because that was a problem during that battle, for example. So, so I'm not saying that the knight is invincible, but I would say almost, meaning that it's really tough. It would be tough to kill, even for another fully armored knight. In fact, I would imagine those kind of duels would have lasted quite a bit, although I am preparing a video on how long would an actual combat situation in the Middle Ages last. So look forward to that if you're interested in this topic. But suffice to say that possibly the only real advantage that normally a Roman would have against any other opponent is his scutum, so the extra defense. But the extra defense the knight has is too superior, because if for whatever reason the knight manages to bypass the scutum, then the limbs of the Roman are exposed. It's too easy for the knight. The Roman has too many gaps. So never mind late medieval knight. What about a early medieval knight? Something on the lines of perhaps a late 11th century Norman knight, or perhaps let's consider 12th century. So the mail is reaching the wrist, okay? And perhaps we've got a closed great helm. I think it would be more interesting. Well, this is a duel that could have a victor in both sides, but I do have to say that again, for the purposes of this video, we will consider that the knight is not on his mount, the knight is on foot, and they are fighting in an arena, as we did for the samurai versus legionary video. Because if we don't do that, and the knight has got the horse, then the legionary will be in trouble. Mostly because, regardless of what armor the legionary is using, whether it be lorica segmentata, whether it be lorica hamata, a powerful strike of a spear or a lance from a knight who is on top of his horse and is running, charging at you, and he has got his feet placed on his stirrups, it's too strong. In fact, that's an interesting point, because you see, Roman armor, whether it be hamata or whether it be segmentata, was strong enough to resist piercing of spears on foot. But the technological advancement of a knight is the fact that having the stirrup, he is a lot more sturdy, and the impact will be absorbed much more, so the knight can put a lot more strength and a lot more force into his attacks. And that's also why when we talk about Roman cavalry, you don't really have that kind of charging with the lance. That's a medieval development, maybe late Roman Empire if you consider cataphracti, of course, but the actual full concept of heavy cavalry is more of a medieval thing. Against that, again, the Roman wouldn't really have much chance. He would have to be amazingly skilled to parry, probably with the shield, and at the same time try to hit and kill the horse, but difficult situation. So they're both fighting one against the other. What are they wearing? Well, again, as we always say with these videos, much will depend on the skill of the combatant. But let's consider a little unlikely, although it might be unlikely, let's consider the two combatants have very similar experience, very similar bodies, very similar training. They are very similar. So we do have to compare now the way of fighting and the equipment they are wearing and using. So let's begin from the equipment. So the medieval knight is using mail. The Roman is using mail, most likely. Because yes, lorica segmentata existed, but still lorica hamata was the most used kind of armor throughout the entirety of Roman history. So if we had to go for percentage, the probability, the chance of the Roman actually wearing hamata would be a lot higher. And I think it's interesting to consider hamata though, because you see, Roman hamata, if you compare it to medieval medieval mail is different. It's different in the sense that it covers less, okay, and whereas medieval mail would cover more and more. But it's also different in terms of links, the sort of inner diameter, for example, of the links. And to be honest, it also depends on what Roman period we're talking about, because if we are talking about early Republican times, then the inner diameter of the rings at the time was very small. We are considering around 4 millimeters inner diameter. But when we go to all the way up to the 2nd century, for example, and the sort of mail hamata that the Romans were using at that time, so imperial times, then they were using much larger rings with an inner diameter between 7 to 7.5 millimeters and possibly a little thicker rings. In any case, it will be riveted, sometimes half riveted, half solid, half punched. There are a lot of possibilities. But already mail, although it seems to be a very uniform kind of protection, it has a lot of variant in terms of mesh, in terms of pattern. But one thing is for sure, mail was very effective. So in both cases, although the kind of mail they're using is quite different, they would both be very effective armor. So could the sword of a Roman, the gladius, penetrate the mail of his opponent? I say no. I bet no. And the reason for that is because the gladius is a one-handed sword. And even if we consider the sword of the medieval knight, a one-handed strike, whether it be a medieval sword or whether it be a Roman sword, is not enough, does not generate enough power to go through a well-made, sturdy mail hauberk or mail armor, whether it be hamata or whether it be medieval armor, because you also have to consider the padding underneath, which is very much part of the armor itself. In fact, testing medieval armor resistance, or mail for example, without the padding makes no sense. It just doesn't. That's the armor is padding underneath and mail. They are together, and that's why it worked. Mail was an incredibly successful kind of armor, the most iconic and the most successful one. With most successful, of course, I don't mean the best kind of armor. The best kind of armor was definitely late 15th century plate, even 16th century plate, but mail was the kind of armor that was used the most. We're talking about 2,000 years. If they used it, it worked. It means it was very difficult to penetrate it. And when I said that a lance in full force during a charge could penetrate armor, is because we have a lot of examples of people talking about this. But although we do have the occasional example where mail actually resisted even the attack of a lance. But although in some cases it's also the idea of the guy is on the ground and the knights are trying to pierce him with a lance, but not during charge, in which case they couldn't. So the Roman has got a weapon that cannot penetrate the armor of his opponent, so he needs to find the gaps. But again, it's not easy to exploit the gaps, also because in the 12th century the guy is almost entirely covered. And with the idea of having also the great helm, wearing also the great helm, then this is going to be very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult for the Roman legionary. On the other hand, what weapon would the knight use against the Roman? Because if the knight is using a sword, then again, underarm, above arm strike, they're both ineffective against for piercing, whether it be segmentata or whether it be hamata. So it's either he half swords, because a powerful half swording strike could go through mail, particularly if the knight is very strong, or I would personally go for a mace or a warhammer. I think that's a kind of weapon that could be effective against the Roman, to at least stun him if you hit him in the head, or cause some damage through the mail if you manage to go through. And in fact, when we look at Roman armor, if you look at it, the fact that they are wearing, for example, double protection for the lorica hamata and also for the segmentata, the shoulders are the parts that have more protection, and that means that it's the part that the scutum manages to protect less. Some people argue that maybe the Romans actually had the shoulder padding for the segmentata, for the hamata, just because it was in the Greek style. In fact, and the Romans did copy the Greeks for a lot of things. In fact, if you consider the Roman lorica hamata, and you compare it to either the Greek spolas, the leather armor, or the famous linothorax, it does look similar. But my opinion on this is that yes, they probably were inspired for that design from the Greeks, But I don't think they only did it for fashion. I think they did it because it was an area that was exposed. But yet, with a warhammer or full force of a mace, I think you could go through. Of course, some people might argue and say, no, I think the sword would be the best option because the Roman has got exposed arms and exposed legs. Although, has he really? Because the scutum is protecting very well those areas, so unless he's incompetent or unless the knight is very skilled, it won't be easy to hit the Roman in his arms. And if the Roman legionary feels that his striking arm is too exposed, then he could still wear a manica on the right side. Although remember, the Roman fighting stance, the fact that the arm is fully retracted, makes it very difficult, because when the Roman goes out to pierce, okay, and that's the only moment that he's exposing his right arm, it's a very quick action of a man who was trained for doing that his entire life. So that must have been incredibly quick, very precise, and difficult to just sort of snipe the arm with a bladed weapon. And that's why, hence, the Romans being so effective at fighting. So that's why I think I wouldn't go for a sword. I would just go for a blunt weapon, so, and maybe a heater shield. So maybe a warhammer on my right hand and a heater shield on left. Shield against shield, sort of managing to get close to each other, and while the Roman tries to find somewhere in my body that he can stab, I can try and smash him as a knight in the head or on the shoulders to cause some trauma. Now, of course, this is a speculative discussion, and much would depend on the skill of the combatants, as I always say, but I would like to hear your opinion, if you agree with me. I think the knight, the 12th century knight, would still have an advantage over the Roman, although if the Roman is skilled enough, he could still win the battle, so it wouldn't be an easy duel for sure. And we are not taking into consideration formation, legions against armies. That would be a completely different series. But in one-to-one duel, the knight a 12th century knight would have an advantage, in my opinion, and a 16th century knight would completely obliterate the Roman. But please let me know in the comments below what you think. I wish to thank you for watching and thank you for your support as always. And remember, the Metatron has spread its wings. Goodbye, and still Roma Invicta. Fanboy's fanboy.